Hi guys, Tuhon Bill McGrath here with some background on the stick to sword transitions in Pekiti-Tirsia and how I've modified some technique for the use of the machete, which acts as a bridge tool between those two weapons. So when we first started training on stick with Tuhon Bill back in the mid-70s, there was a real emphasis on keeping the weapon close to your body. One of the drills we used to do was 4 diagonal cuts, but our warm-up would be up against a wall, and we had to get as close as possible to that wall without hitting it with our weapon. And the reason for this is, you want to be able to move your weapon very close to your body, protect your body. You need good footwork to do this. If you just stood there, a lot of the movements, especially number 3, you would not be able to get in as good a protection of close quarter protection of your body. Stationary is with good footwork, right? Sidestepping. So our guards with the stick in basic work were weight in the back leg, stick out in front of us, arms close to the body. So weight is on my back leg, so the lead leg is mobile. This is allow sidestepping without putting torque into your knee. At least one of the reasons is. And you're siding the opponent over the tip of the stick. When we started in the late 70s to go to Sagitas, which was our first step in advanced weapon work, our guard was like this, loaded with the left hand kind of balancing at the midpoint of the stick. And Sagitas does a lot of close, tight, small motions. And by this point, we could generate enough force in those small motions to be worthwhile, right? That's why it's advanced. You'll notice there's a odd little movement with the left hand in here. We're protecting the forehead, right, before we come up and thrust. And that's to act as a bit of a shield. If in stick work, you can go and, you can get hit in the hand is better than getting hit in the forehead. However, when we went to sword work in the early 80s, we would do Sagitas this way. Now, instead of that initial movement being a jab, it was now drawing a sword out of a sheath, and then that drop would be, or the left hand protection would be the left hand holding the scabbard up on your forehead, and if his blade came in, you'd actually extend and brush it aside so you're not catching it force on force. Brush it aside and then do your rest of your technique. So things that are done with a stick in Pekiti-Tirsia get modified when you have a sword. If you notice, this is a lightweight columns machete. I can do a bit of a jab on that, but it makes a lot more sense if you're doing it from a sword draw. And a lot of the sheaths in the Philippines is not one, obviously, would be laid in the belt or sash, and everything would come out as a unit from the sash, and then you draw your weapon. And that motion here, instead of a jab to the eyes, is drawing the weapon with the momentum of the blade, the weight of the blade, into the movement. So I'm not jabbing with the wrist, it's just raising with the shoulder, and as a person goes for that, I can come and cut behind that, right? So a modification of how you use the transition between stick technique and sword technique in Pekiti-Tirsia. So one thing that was always emphasized in our training in the old days was to keep your stick very tight to your body and moving as much of the time between you and your opponent as possible. So you really would kind of aim that stick off of that juncture between your trapezius and your shoulder and go right out to target. I remember him telling me one time, you're trying to think like you're nailing a nail into a piece of wood, hitting directly in, as opposed to coming up high and dropping down onto the target. So everything was done with the idea of you're hitting more of an ellipse into the target, that, let's say, egg shape hit, as opposed to doing a full circle where you're kind of rotating on your shoulder, right? So I just mentioned we would not make these big cuts. When we were first learning stick and sword technique from Tuhon Bill, everything was very tight. tight movements. For instance, like Sagitas, you're in 5 attacks. Everything was tight from the shoulder. That's why I was surprised when I saw graduate guy training the Philippine military in the mid-90s and making very wide cuts, very high cuts as he's training these guys, right? And that surprised me until I spoke to one of the guys who was doing the training at that time. And he said, look, these guys only have 2 weeks to train before they're out in the jungle doing patrols against terrorists. The point man is going to be going and cutting brush, clearing a trail, and if he sees a terrorist there, he has to charge in and take this guy out before he can alert his buddies, right? That's why you have a soldier with a sword in his hand. So with 2 weeks of training, what can you give them that's going to keep them from cutting themselves? When I was a kid first learning stick technique, it's very common to brush my ear or maybe smack myself in the back of the head, I think one time. But it's a lightweight rattan stick. So this lightweight stick is not going to really hurt you, right? However, if you're starting off people with a sword and it's maybe only 2 weeks until they might actually use that sword in a fight, where back in the old days when we spent years on a stick before we got a sword in our hand, if they only have a 2-week course, how do you keep them safe? One way to do that without cutting themselves is to make these big wide cuts. So in the Machete class, I use 3 guard positions. In the old days, our delivery with a forehand with a stick is very high up on the trapezius, close to the body. It's almost like a boxer's guard. So you're very, very tight in there. But there'd be many years training with a stick before you get to an edged weapon. But if you don't have time for that, what I'm doing in the Machete class, at least the bridging technique, is having the people loaded on their shoulder. So while they're cutting, they're delivering a broader X, let's say, and having it chamber or index on your shoulder gives you more standoff distance, let's say, between the back of your head and ear to the blade, where up on the trapezius you can see it's much less distance. So the idea here from this position is you're in the middle of cutting. You're clearing a jungle trail or even a trail up here in upstate New York. We have all kinds of vines growing across trails with ticks on them with Ehrlichia or Lyme disease or nasty things like that. You don't want to touch it. You want to cut it so you don't have the ticks crawling on you, right? If you were attacked in that environment or, down in the jungle and you get attacked, you're in the middle of this motion, and from your chamber you can turn and deliver from something you've already been doing. It's less of a transition. It's an easier transition. Next, what I'll give as our basic stance is here, left hand on the wrist. This is our double force position in Pekiti-Tirsia. Double force kind of means you have 2 hands worth of power and control over your long tool, but you do not, you don't have enough handle length to get 2 hands on the grip. So you put your left hand on the wrist for a right-handed person, and you work from there. And this gives you good control, more power. If you have to get a good amount of power from a short distance, for instance, if I'm working or in guard and I get attacked here, I can bring my body around and do a snap at here. If I'm cut to my right side, I can push it there. And because I have 2 hands on it, I have a better chance of getting enough power to do the job than simply one hand. So the next guard I have is what I call a travel guard, and that's where you take the blade, put it on the arm, and have it flat against your arm so the edge is facing out. And this is good if you're traveling in an area where you think you might get attacked soon, but you don't want to display the blade as a guard here or a guard here, or even down by your leg, which may be less noticeable, but from afar you can still see that blade. And it takes longer to come up and protect your body. So if you're down here in the travel guard and you get attacked, then you can come up. This is protecting against the most likely cut that an opponent would deliver, which is a forehand cut. So against a right-handed opponent, his forehand would be against my left side if I'm a right-handed person. Bang over here, and I'm guarding against that. And then I can cut, very easily from there, right? And then from later on in the fight, or let's say if I want to keep the travel guard in the middle of the fight, then I can simply raise it up here. I'm using that pommel as a front sight to help judge my distance better to the target, and I can block or cut and move from there. All right, another obvious difference between a machete and a sword is the guard, right? With a guard on your sword, he comes down, catches against your guard, and you push it out of the way and then cut, right? With a machete, you can't do that. So, one of the things I do to help solve that problem in the course is through footwork. So, let's say this is my opponent's center line to center line. He goes in to cut me. Instead of trying to push through his attack and then cut there, I want to step offline, avoid that, and then immediately do not wait for him to possibly slide down my blade, but immediately launch off and go after his eyes to knock him out, to take away his vision, and then get some more range after that. So instead of blocking and then riding up on his sword like we might do in breakout drill with a stick, or a sword with a good cross guard, what you want to do is things more like you would see in Contratus and Pekiti-Tirsia, which is dealing with a stronger opponent, where you're getting off his power stroke of the attack and then immediately launching up, getting outside his line and continuing on. I'll show you that on the bob bag so you get an idea. So here I am center line to center line with bob. If I had a sword with a cross guard and he cuts at me, you have to imagine Bob doesn't have arms today. I might parry this out, break out, and do my cut, right? Because I'll be able to catch on his sword with my cross guard. But if I don't have that, then I have to use more Contratus theory from Pekiti-Tirsia, where I'll come in and hit this sword out of the way, and then immediately go up to the eyes, and then step back and get a cut offline. I'll move Bob so you can see the other side of that. So here we are lined up center line to center line. He comes in. I cannot hit, ride up, and counter cut like I can with a stick or a sword with a cross guard. Can't do that with a machete. So if I'm lined up center line to center line, what I have to do is sidestep, take that initial impact, but immediately, as soon as I can, launch up into his eyes, push and get something to take out his weapon arm at a distance, so I'm less likely to get cut, or at least less likely to get the full impact of his weapon. So some little things you might need to do to modify your technique when you have a transition or a bridge blade like the machete, which has a sharp edge like a sword. It's light like your stick, but it doesn't have the cross guard of a sword. So it does make a good bridging tool to understand the differences between a stick and a sword. Thank you guys. Train hard, but train smart.